There we go. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Chatham Conservation Foundation 2026 Winter Webinar Series. I'd like to start it out with a great big thank you to the Chatham Cultural Center for sponsoring us, allowing these webinars to take place. So these started back in February. Happy March, everyone. We have four more webinars, three if you're not counting the one today. Today is how internal clocks control daily and seasonal behaviors in birds. And if you're interested in signing up for any of the other webinars, feel free to sign up on our website after. And if you guys don't mind sharing in the chat how you discovered this webinar, we're really trying to figure out how outreach is working and where else we should start sharing these. Lastly, before we get into it, I want to remind everyone or let everyone know that Earth Week is coming back in April from April 19th to the 26th. We're going to have our walks, talks, sapling giveaways for Arbor Day and a fourth annual town cleanup, as well as our town forum where we will be focusing on why dark skies matter, and more information about that can be found on our website as well. But now for today, I will hand it over to James Junda from the Mass Audubon, and he's going to talk about birds and how their circadian clock works. So thank you, James. Sorry, I'll stop my
Okay.
share.
Oh, no, stop your share. I think I got mine going. Just go ahead and share my PowerPoint to start. How's that? Is that working?
Oh man, why does mine look like that? There we go. Yep, it's good.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for everybody for coming this morning. I've been reading a fair amount about this topic lately. We know we like to think a lot about it as animals as kind of thinking their way through the world and kind of in real human terms, but a lot of this stuff is really programmed and a lot of it is just controlled by the brain. There's obviously things that are happening afterwards where there's some thinking and some, but these clocks, these are things that are just hardwired in the bird's brain, and it's really important for them to be able to manage a 24-hour clock. And then how do they know when the seasons are coming? How do they know when to start breeding? How do they know when to start migrating? How do they manage all of that kind of stuff? Timing is really, really important for birds. One thing we see in the spring is the arrival dates are just so synchronized. It's spectacular. So I walk the same trails every day at Wellfleet Bay when I'm running the banding station from April 15th to June 1st. I get to see how things change every day. I'm counting birds every day. I'm documenting what we're seeing every day. And there's one day, it's the first really warm day in the first 10 days of May, where our breeding male catbirds all return on the same exact day. So there's a few catbirds trickling through. You might see one singing, or you see a bird hopping around a couple days. But then one day, all of a sudden, there's six catbirds on their territory singing the entire morning. And when you catch one of those birds, you see that it has a band that we've captured it in previous seasons. So somehow these birds are timing this to leave different places, somewhere along the Gulf Coast, somewhere down in Florida, somewhere in Central America, and then arriving back on Wellfleet Day at the same time. It's really just like amazing, amazing stuff that they're able to do all this. So we'll start with the circadian clock. So that's the circle day clock. That's the single day clock. Made famous. Cuckoo clocks are a famous thing that's associated with birds and clocks, but it's the rhythm of the day. It's the rhythm of the night. It's how they know when to go to sleep, how they know when to wake up, and how they know how to do all this stuff and keep it straight. And then how that's kind of adjusted by external inputs. And then the circannual rhythm, which is the rhythm of the seasons, when to breed and when to migrate. So circadian rhythms best understood by this Audubon Society bird clock, um, which is a very iconic clock. I know that I had this clock when I was growing up. So, what is the function of the clock? How does the bird know it's day versus night, and what's different in those things? How is the external input important to this process? How do the birds sleep? There are different types of the sleep. Sleeping with half a brain, which is really important to birds. Humans have uh, hemi- different hemispheres for the brains. That is way more extreme in birds. I actually have an organ that separates the two sides of the brains. And then what are the actual functions of sleep? So, circadian clock, it's an enzymatic controlled clock and it's adjusted by external input. So, what it is it's a feedback loop, which is an incredibly important concept in pretty much all enzymatic biology. This is how most processes in the body and the cell work. It's just super simplified because everything's kind of interacting with everything at the same time. But this is the way genes are expressed in pretty much every cell, and this is how it works for time. So, in mammals, which is this is really well understood, and I'll probably mention this a lot in this talk, birds and mammals have very different brains, but they function in very similar ways. Birds have language, birds have complex socials, and those birds, as a result, have to do the same things that the complex mammals like humans and primates do, but their brains evolved completely separately from a very basic reptilian ancestor. So their different parts of their brains have evolved to do the same thing, so they've done a lot of work just kind of blowing up all the terminology of bird brains because they were all named after mammal brains, but they're totally different parts of the brain doing the same thing. So a lot of these concepts I'm going to talk about apply to way more broadly than just this. But the enzymatic control of the clock. So you have two genes, the purr gene and the cry gene, and they are activated. And then the DNA creates the mRNA that goes out of the cell nucleus, and then it's activated and it creates these two programs, the per program protein and the cry protein. Then they are attracted to each other and combine. And once they're combined, that is able to cross back into the cell nucleus, where it is then broken down, reattaches to the DNA, and shuts down the manufacture of the protein. So, what happens is two things are created. They can't do anything. They go outside the cell nucleus, they combine to form a protein. But then, when there's too many of those proteins, they go back into the cell nucleus and shut down the gene. And this process of building them up and then breaking them down takes about 24 hours. And that's the clock. It forms these proteins. The proteins then break down, turn off the DNA, and then the cycle starts again, and it takes about 24 hours. It's really cool, and that's just how feedback loops work. But that's not enough. It does need this external input. So birds have a third eye. It's a lot of animals have this, humans, in a spiritual sense do. But birds, the skull's so thin that they can sense the light through the skull, through the skin, and directly on the pineal gland in their brain. So the light comes in, it shines in three different places: the retina, the pineal gland, and this SCN, which I wrote down because it's a very interesting word. It's suprachiasmatic nucleus. But essentially, what's happening is you've got this pathway where the pineal is producing melatonin, which tells the birds to sleep. And then the light comes in and it turns off the melatonin in the sympathetic pathway. And then the bird wakes up. And so the process cycles, but then it gets this light input that keeps it adjusted. So, what happens if we mess with that process? So, this is kind of a complicated graph here. The key to think about is there's three different studies. There's three different groups here. The top group, where it says light and dark, those are exposed to 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark. The next group, where it says continuous dim light, those birds are just stuck in a 24-hour dim light cycle. And then where it says SCN lesion, that means below that is a third group of birds. So this top group here, those birds show where it shows light and there's a lot of dark patches here, that's bird activity. So when it's dark, there's very little activity, and then it gets light, the birds are active, then it gets dark, the birds are inactive, then it gets light, the birds are active, the dark, the birds are inactive. That's what you would want. But what happens if it's just continuous dim light? You get rid of the daylight and the nighttime, and you can see that there's periods of action and then there's periods of inaction, but it's drifting over time. As you go down on this, what you see is that it's slowly drifting out of sync with the actual 24-hour clock. And then the SCN is the thing that kind of manages all of this. So a lot of brain research involves putting a lesion on it, which essentially means stabbing it because it kills that section of the brain, and then it doesn't do its function anymore. And when it doesn't do its function, this bird has no sense of day of cycles at all. It's activity 24 hours a day, inactivity 24 hours a day. So this is how they do a lot of this stuff. Is you remove something and then you see what happens in an experimental setting. This is a complicated graph here, but it is a beautiful graph. So this is kind of showing the same thing. It shows how it continues even if the light's removed, but it gets messed up. So the one on the left here in vivo is the cells are in the bird's brain, and then it's exposed to daylight. And then when nighttime comes, the melatonin levels go up. They use melatonin, like a lot of things are the same. The melatonin helps them sleep. So 12 hours of light, melatonin goes up, and then it starts to go down, and at 24 hours, it's daylight again. The one on the left is cultured pineal cells. So they take the cells out of the bird, put them in a tray and grow them, and then they can control it more. So in this one, if you start at the left side here, it's dark, starting at 0, melatonin levels go up. The light comes on, melatonin levels go down to 0. But then for the next 24 to 48 to 72 hours, they take the light away completely. And you can see the melatonin levels are going up and down, up and down. It's following the same pattern, but it's not as good. It's not going down to 0. And it's a little bit more kind of out of sync. And over time, it'll get more and more out of sync. So these are really great at what they're showing us is that these birds have this built-in clock, but over time it drifts without external input. But that would also allow them to kind of adjust seasonally, right? So if a bird migrates at the tropics, it's 12 hours a day of dark, but when it's at its breeding grounds in the northern Arctic, there's only 6 hours a day of dark. So they need to be able to adjust for that. 24-hour clock's great, but at day length it changes. You need to be able to adjust for that. That's where this comes in. So sleep is something we're starting to understand a lot more about in birds. Understanding processes like that in the brain are really hard. That's why we're learning so much now. I mean, the brain, it's really just, if you just look at it, it's a clump of brown, but there's a lot going on in there, right? So we're going to talk about sleep states. We're going to talk about the functions of sleep, and then we're going to sleep with one eye open. So there's two main types of sleep. There's a lot of intermediate phases that people generally think are less important, or just kind of, they're probably important, but less well understood. So we're going to talk about two main types of sleep here. Rapid eye movement, REM, we all know about this. This is our dreaming sleep. It has a really specific purpose. And then SWS, shallow wave sleep. This is the sleep, where you're just down and not moving and not dreaming. And this is really important too. And we kind of understand these two fairly well. So sleep stages, this is pigeons here. And oops, sorry about that, go back. So what this is showing is when they're in slow wave sleep, they have these, if you look at the EEG at the top here, slow waves, big slow waves. That's why it's called that. But the neck and the eyes aren't moving. And then you get into this brief batch of REM sleep, and then the waves in the EEG go down, but then the neck starts moving and the eyes start moving, right? That's the rapid eye motion. So this is showing that pigeons have the same sleep pattern we do. And then, of course, the functions of sleep. So the SWS, the slow wave sleep, is maintenance. It's about cleaning the brain out. Biological processes produce waste, and this is going to help get rid of those waste. And then the REM is all about learning. I'll come back to both of these tables, but the SWS is maintenance, cleaning out your brain, and the REM is um, reinforcing what you learned during the day. So SWS is what we have. There's this fluid. It's called, with a beautiful naming, interstitial fluid. And essentially what happens is lots of use results in lots of waste. So if that part of your brain is really active during the day, it's doing all these biological processes, and that produces waste. Antioxidants are a famous example of that in our muscles. Birds have so many antioxidants during migration because they're working and they're working and they're working. And a byprocess of all that muscle is antioxidants. And the brains have the same thing. You go through all these processes of the neurons firing, and there's a bunch of stuff that's just waste processes that you got to get rid of that. So what happens with the slow wave sleep is if a bird's been working that part of the brain a lot during the day, when they go to bed, the cells shrink of the brain, increasing the room for the fluid to flow between the individual cells and remove all of the toxins. Um, really, really interesting process, and kind of a simple one that makes a lot of sense, right? Like if something's more active, it produces more waste. And how do you get stuff out of the cells? Well, you run a bunch of water over it, which is the interstitial fluid, and it rinses away all the bad stuff. That's very, very simply what's happening. Of course, it's for audio, so I'm sure it's a lot more complicated. So the experimental proof of this is pretty cool. A lot of this work is done with pigeons. Pigeons do really well in captivity. Um, they're domesticated already for the most part, and they're actually really, really smart animals in a lot of ways. They look dumb, but they're actually have really complex social things, really good like learning and behaviors and all kinds of stuff to study, which is part of the reason why they do well in the city, because they're smart. Smart birds do well in the city. That's the whole chapter in this book about that. So what this bird is showing that is one eye's covered, and then it's forced to watch the life of birds all day out of just one eye. And when both sides, on the baseline night, when it's not forced to watch the show, the left and the right side of the brain, which is the left side of this graph is showing the left side and the right side of the brain are the same. But if one side's covered and the other side is exposed all day to this movie, you can see there's significant asymmetry. And what it's saying is the side of the brain that was exposed is way more SWS interstitial fluid because it worked a lot more. So as a result, however they measure this, it's some complicated thing, but the key is that it's separate. The left side of the brain has a lot more SWS. It has a lot more interstitial fluid. It needs to do more maintenance because it works so hard. Okay, so REM for learning. This is the more interesting part. All right, yeah, the brain gets dirty when it gets used. They got to clean it out. So it's got more maintenance workers there. That's cool. But this is much more about bird behavior. So I got Conrad Lorenz down here, one of the most famous bird biologists of all time. He's the guy that discovered imprinting. If you don't know what imprinting is, some of the larger birds, mainly birds that as soon as they hatch, they start following their parents around. So ducks, chickens, all these ground birds that as soon as they hatch, they're just walking. Well, they need to know what their parent is, or else who are they going to follow? And it turns out it's actually not genetically hardwired in these birds. So the first thing that they see moving, they decide is their parents. And Conrad Lorenz did that with geese, where he would hatch them, and then he would sit in front of them and move around, and then they would spend their first year of life just following them around. Really important process. This is how we got whooping cranes to adopt migration. You ever seen the movies or the stories where they use the plane and the birds follow the plane to learn how to migrate? That's all based on imprinting. Really, really important biological process. So like I said, the chicks imprint on a moving object soon after hatching, and they want to be able to reinforce that when they're sleeping, but they also want to not enforce other things. This is really, really like eat grain and imprint. That's all they need to do at the beginning, and cower if something flies over. Those are like their three responses. So what this graph the imprinting of the rotating cylinder, I would ignore that top graph. It's pretty complicated, and I wasn't really that clear on what it's showing. But the bottom one shows a lot more. So what you have is these two imprinting sessions, and then the response of the brain while they're sleeping after the section. So what it is if they're imprinted, the part of the brain that's responsible for the imprinting has crazy REM sleep the next night and the next night and the next night. But if they're exposed to other stimulus that are not imprinting stimulus, because that's what they want to do, they need to ignore this other stuff or it's just going to mess them up and they'll be bad for life. They don't respond to those stimulus. They're not learning about them because there's no benefit of learning about them. But the benefit of the imprinting is life. So they don't fire after the other ones. This is a more interesting look at this. So this is REM learning in zebra finches. Sorry, excuse me. So zebra finches are one of the most studied birds on the planet. There's a bunch of reasons for that. They do really well in captivity. They have complex social behaviors. They breed really quickly, and they have song learning and a lot of really interesting. I mean, there's books and books and books on zebra finches. They are absolutely fascinating animals, and they've been domesticated for so long that they have these like genetic trees where they know who begat all the way back. They have like Bibles worth of books on these birds. So the way song learning works in these is a little bit of variation in song learning among species. Some of them it's fairly hardwired and they do a little bit of learning. Zebra finches, they have a really, really basic song. And then they learn a more complex song. And if they never learn the more complex song, then they never attract a mate. So they have this genetically wired song, and then they learn from the song in their early year of life. What that really means is while they're in the nest, they're listening to the males around them sing. And you know how birds work, while they're in the nest and they're listening to the males around them sing, what that means is they're listening to their father sing, because it's their territorial bird. So they should be hearing one bird loud and then maybe some other birds in the distance. So the idea is that they would have this hardwired simple song. Then they're exposed to this other song, i.e., their father's song, and then they learn that song while in the nest, listening to this other bird sing. So what they've done in this is they take the young males, they expose them to a song while they have wires in their brain, and the wires tell them which cells, which nucleuses or neuron cells are being activated while they're learning to sing, and in what pattern. Ding, 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 ding. So what we see here is if we look at this graph on the right here, this is a single nucleus. If we look at the top row here of neuron number 1 here, while it's singing, these are where it's active, little ding, 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 ding. And then if we go during sleep, we can see it's not perfect, but the same pattern. It's a single cell, but it's activating in the same pattern as when it heard the song. And then they do the same thing with a separate neuron, and we can see it's reacting in the same pattern. This is reinforcing learning right here. The cell is firing in the pattern of the song during the day, and then at night it's firing in the exact same pattern of the song. That's reinforcing learning. This is what REM sleep does. But really, it's just really, really kind of interesting stuff about how, like, the fact that they can just like measure this stuff. I just find it so amazing and so interesting. And we're learning a lot right now about these birds. So sleeping with one eye open. So we all hear a lot about, hemispheric brains in humans. I'm a left brain person. I'm a right brain person. There's definitely some kind of truth to that. Well, birds, it's even more extreme. So they have two hemispheres of the brains, just like mammals. The name of the organ, which I wrote down, but I don't seem to have in front of me right now. But there's an organ that separates the two hemispheres of the brain. So in humans or most mammals, there's a couple exceptions, and they're really key to why this concept's important. The brain It's very connected. So there's two hemispheres, but there's a bunch of wires going between them. In birds and cetaceans, whales and dolphins, they have well, the birds have an organ, and the whales and dolphins have a limited number of connections. So there's an organ that separates the two hemispheres in birds so they don't talk. So the right eye talks to the left brain, the left eye talks to the right brain, but the right brain never talks to the left brain. And it allows these birds to sleep with one eye open. So when the right eye is open, the left side of the brain's awake, and the right side of the brain can just be full on sleeping at that point. Um, and and the reason cetaceans have this um, is because they sleep in the ocean and they need half of their brain awake so they don't fall asleep and drown. So they can sleep while one of their half of their brain is bringing them up to the surface to gather air and come back. So they're half of their brain sleeping, and the other half of their brain is literally keeping them from drowning. And birds, it's the same kind of. These are prey animals, so they have this. How it evolved, we don't know. They got this thing. This is how they do it. And it actually starts in the egg. So if you look at a chick, a fetal chick, whatever you call it, a chick developing in an egg, they'll sleep with one side down and one side up in the egg. And if you rotate the egg, the embryo will rotate so it's always the same side facing up and always the same side facing down. And it actually leads to direct differentiation between the eyes. So the eye that's always facing up is the eye it uses to look for predators when it's foraging, and the eye that's always facing down is the eye that it looks to look for food. And the eye that's always facing up is exposed to light in the egg, so it's more light sensitive, so it's better at looking at the sky. And this eye that's always faces down in the egg is better at looking at close things, and it's less exposed to light, so it's actually more light sensitive. But you get the idea that this differentiation happens in the egg, which is really, really, really cool. Um, but as far as birds go, what does it mean? So if they can sleep with one eye open, they can fly with one wing open. So this is best studied in frigate birds. So this shows the two sides of the brain, and it shows that when the bird is sleeping in flight, so this left dominant, right dominant things, or when the bird's actually asleep in flight, and when it's doing the left dominant wing, it's steering with its left wing while the whole side of its right body, its right wing is asleep with its right brain. And then when it's doing the right dominant side, it's steering with its right wing while its left wing is asleep. There's no flapping involved in this. This is just gliding, but it's able to make enough adjustments with one side that half of its brain and half of its body, well, the brain control of that half of the body is asleep and is only steering with one side. And this allows these birds to fly for days without having to sleep. That being said, frigate birds do land. And when they land, they sleep, just like other birds. Right? This isn't the only way they sleep, but they're able to do this. But again, this works. Like I said, they're not flapping. This is just gliding. So these incredible blackpoll warblers that are flying nonstop from Cape Cod to Venezuela aren't doing this. They're awake the whole time because they can't flap in this situation. Or maybe they can. We don't know. A frigate bird's a big bird. It's a lot easier to measure than blackpoll warbler. And if you put a brain measure on a blackpoll warbler and send it out over the Atlantic, it's not going to make it. So we haven't done that yet. A lot of this is just frigate bird's big bird. A lot easier to study. So circadian rhythm summary. Sleep patterns with birds, they often come in short bouts, flipping back and forth between the two hemispheres. And this allows them to see predators coming, escape, and then also just kind of fly with one wing, which is really cool. And then the sleep purpose, as I said, is it's learning and cleaning. There's probably other purposes to the brain that we don't understand, but those are the real kind of simple ones that we've been able to suss out. Really, really interesting stuff. So the circannual clock. So this is more of a calendar. I'll go back and forth. Sometimes I call it a clock. Sometimes I call it a calendar, but it's a bird calendar. Here's a bird calendar. We all know what bird calendars look like, and they have one. So the circannual clock, how do we know it works? Well, a lot of this is about petting birds in isolation. So this is European work. The work was done, I believe, with stone chats, black caps, and I'm not sure what this other one is, but some kind of indistinguishable European warbler, I believe. And what they did is look at the number of years here. So 12 years, 12 years, 10 years. These birds were held in isolation in cages. Well, I think it's more of an aviary, but they're held for 12 years in 12-hour days. So this is the equatorial winter daylight. 12 hours day, 12 lights of dark for 12 years. Like, somebody was really into this. Um, and what we see is that they seasonally still enter molt, and they seasonally still try to breed, i.e., the testes grow. But over time, the timing drifts. So instead of being a perfect pattern, it drifts, and it gets earlier and earlier and shorter, and it just kind of gets messed up with time. Not that much for 12 years, but what this tells you is even when they don't have the external input, the calendar still functions, and they're able to stick with those patterns even 12 years in, but it drifts, just like the clock. It drifts. It needs that external input to correct it. Um, so in the Northern Hemisphere, it makes sense how they adjust it. The daylight changes, right? So in the winter, daylight's short. And then in the spring, daylight gets longer. And that is a trigger for these birds to enter breeding behavior. So you hold these birds and you have them in a controlled environment, and they have the winter hours, 12 hours a day, or this is, what do they have? The short days. So they do 6 hours of daylight and then darkness for the rest of the day. And then what happens if you switch it, so they have the 15 hours of daylight and the 9 hours of darkness, the testes grow and the bird wants to breed. Makes sense. Spring comes, boom, time to breed. So they're reacting to the light. And then they took that a little bit further, which is kind of an interesting thing. It doesn't have that much real world significance, but they're like, well, is it because they're seeing that there's 15 hours a day? Or is it just because at a time when it would normally be dark, it's light? So the third one, where it's the short day and long pulse on the bottom, all they did was make it bright for an hour in the middle of the photoinducible period, as they call it. But in the winter, it would be dark. In the spring, it would be light for that period. And they let it go dark, and then they just turn the lights on for an hour at this important period. And the birds' testes grow and they start to breed. So it shows that they're not measuring the amount of hours in the day. They're just seeing if it's light at this time when it would be dark in winter. And then that kind of triggers them. So that's good. That's birds in a temperate environment. The spring comes, the day length gets longer, the birds trigger to breed, right? We see that here with songs. So songs are a bit more complicated, especially if you look at tropical birds. But if you're looking at the temperate birds, usually the way it works is the males sing, female attracted to male. So the male sings during the breeding season. There's no benefit for singing the rest of the year. They sing during the breeding season. So just like the testes, this gets activated and then they start singing. So what these graphs show is the top one, if you look at where it says 1 and there's a dashed line, that's the baseline HVC RA and area X of the brain kind of volume. So what's interesting is the parts of the brain actually get bigger. So what this is showing that is when they're exposed to sunlight and testosterone, then they start to show more of these parts of the brain swell. So spotted towhee, the part above the level 1, really big. Western song sparrow, a little bit less. White crowned sparrow is pretty significant. Dark-eyed junco also increases in size. And you don't have to worry about what the HVC, the area X. I mean, yeah, that seems to imply that we understand a lot about that area. But these are parts of the brain that are associated with the song. And then the bottom one is actually much more straightforward. So day 0, those are the levels. At that point, the bird is exposed to longer days and a testosterone implant. And 7 days, the size of those areas swell. By day 20, they're all at their maximum size. So this bird is exposed to longer days, injected with testosterone, and then all the parts of the brain associated with song start to swell. What's interesting is if you don't expose them to the light change and you just inject them with the testosterone, this doesn't work. They need the light change to start the cascade, to start the cells to even be able to accept the testosterone to do this. So it is the light change. And a lot of this stuff is, these are cascades where like the light shines on the pineal gland at what would normally be dark, but now it's light because it's summer, and then that starts producing these hormones that affect another part of the brain that starts sending out a hormone that lets the gonads be able to react to the testosterone. And then when the testosterone comes, so all kinds of controls in the real world that we have trouble measuring. So that's why we have to do these things where we turn on the light and shoot them for a testosterone and see what happens, because we're really at a basic level for this stuff. But that's all fine. That's temperate. But what does a bird do in the equator, where it's 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night, spring, summer, fall, winter, doesn't matter, 12 hours a day, every day. So how do they know when it's time to breed? If you're a migrant, how do you know when it's time to depart? This is a blackpoll warbler map. So these birds are wintering on the equator, and they have to time it to arrive in this orange part, or Alaska, say, on the same day like the catbirds. All the males got to get there on the same day so they can establish a territory. And how do they do that when it's 12 hours, endless 12-hour days on the equator? Well, they do have seasons in these other places. So there's a rainy season, there's a dry season, there's a season when X plant flowers, there's a season when X insects bloom. So they are looking at local conditions that aren't day length. But the internal clock is really key. We look at the timing of these birds, and they're departing on a certain day, not a or a date, not a day, a date. So they're looking at the weather conditions, or they're looking at the daylight, and that's triggering them to migration based upon what they recorded in the fall. So it is triggered to start thinking about migration by the day length, based upon what they learned in the fall. But then there's also local conditions, and we're going to talk about that more. So the day length says, well, I'm 90 days away from the day that triggered me to start migrating, but there's no insect bloom that I need to start, so they'll wait. So this is really more complicated. I don't think I'm doing a really good job explaining it, but the idea is there's something about their internal clock telling them want to go, but then they're looking at the local conditions to actually control when they can go. And that's a very important connection to the environment that we're going to talk about more. But nonetheless, it's an incredibly accurate calendar when they can kind of base their timing on when to depart to arrive someplace on the other side of the equator at the right time as everybody else. So these changes impact their migration behavior in pretty significant ways. This is one of the first really interesting kind of migration studies. And this is just such a famous, simple study. So the birds start, the migration light changes, the local conditions changes, whatever something in their clock tells them it's time, or their calendar tells them to start migrating. They start orienting every bit of their life in that direction. So if this bird is obviously supposed to go, what this is showing is it goes southeast for migration. That's the directional vector. And what you do is you build this funnel. It's got a stamp pad in the bottom, and then where all those footprints are is white paper. And the bird hops on the stamp pad and then hops on the paper in the direction it wants to go. And this bird wants to go southeast. So that's directional motivation. They forage in the direction they want to go. They hop in the direction they want to go. Everything in their brain starts telling them orient southeast, 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 southeast. Really, really cool. And what else they do is this nocturnal restlessness. So usually songbirds migrate at night. So during migration season, they need to be active at night. And that's what starts happening. So their clock tells them to start being awake at night and start heading in southeast in this birds. And then they do it. But there's other body changes that they have to do to prepare for migration. They need to be able to start putting on fat, which they can't do the rest of the year. So they need to be able to change their physiology to start putting on fat. Their gonads shrink. No need to have big breeding organs when you're not going to be breeding. That's just extra weight and extra blood use during migration. And the muscles change. The leg muscles shrink because they don't need to do a lot of perching. And then the body muscles start growing and their flight muscles start growing. So all of that takes a little bit of time. So they need to be able to have their calendar telling them it's time to start preparing for migration before they start migrating. And that's why the calendar is really important. Food storage by season is another really interesting one. Temperate birds have a lot of winter that they have to deal with. And winter, it's not cold that kills birds, it's lack of access to food that drives them south. So if you're an insect eating bird like a warbler, you have to migrate south because there's no insects in the winter. But if you can eat seeds like a chickadee, you can stay farther north. If you're a finch and you're eating seeds, you can stay farther north. And it's not the cold that gets you, it's the food that gets you. So there's this graph shows one thing. I'm going to talk about something else, but what this shows is the retrieval percentages of birds and then the number of neurons associated with memory. So black-capped chickadees have an incredibly wide range. They go all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast and all the way up into Alaska and then down through like the middle of the country. At a certain point, it becomes Carolina chickadees in the South, but the black-capped chickadee has a really, really wide range. So as you can imagine, what this is saying is the ones in Colorado and the ones in Alaska have pretty different winter situations. In Alaska, there's about 6 or 7 hours of daylight. That's all they can do to forage in the winter is that very short period of time. But in Colorado, there's still like 12. So they have way, way, way more foraging hours. And as a result, the ones in Alaska need to hide more food during the summer. Chickadees cache food. They take a seed from your feeder, fly away, and hide that one seed. And they can hide up thousands and thousands and thousands of seeds and then remember where they are. So when winter comes, they can forage if the weather's good, but if the weather's not good, they go right to where their seeds are and fill up all those seeds because they need to get enough energy to survive the night and not freeze to death at night when they can't forage, so they can wake up the next day to forage all day to survive the next night. And in Alaska, that's really, really, really dependent on food storage. So as a result, the part of their brain that's associated with food storage, it's much, much, much larger. And you can see on the bottom right, it's the number of neuron relative to food store for the food storage part of the brain. You can see in Kansas, 1.4 versus 2.0. They're very, very significant differences. But it's not only this, there's also a seasonal change in the brain structure. So if you're going to remember the location of 15,000 seeds, you don't want to remember those seeds next year when they've expired. They go bad, they rot, they burst. It's not useful to have that memory. In fact, it's disadvantage if you're trying to look for last year's rotten food when you should be looking for this year's fresh food. And as a result, the part of their brain that is there to memorize the food location shrinks during the summer, so they don't have to give it energy, but it also forgets all the expired food locations. And then next year, as they're using it, it grows and expands and allows them to remember all of these food locations. Really, really cool seasonal stuff. So birds have these really intense rhythms, but what happens when we start messing with them? Climate change is a big one. I said this is a phenological mismatch. So the birds are being triggered by their clock, but it's also over the last 2 million years, they've evolved these patterns where there's a burst of insects in Venezuela, and then they fatten up, and that powers them up to the Yucatan, where they hit another burst of insects that's based upon some tree flowering there. And they hit that, and then that powers them, and they jump over the Gulf of Mexico into Texas, where they're expecting to hit this other bloom. And then they got to hit another bloom in Kansas, and then they got to hit this. But those blooms are all messed up. They're supposed to hit these insects, but the insects are blooming earlier, they're blooming later. There's a different non-native thing there that's doing some other thing that's not helping them. So I explain this as the Plinko effect. What we see now is the birds used to migrate through and arrive at their breeding grounds at a certain time. So your migration window at a banding station, you saw every blackpoll warbler within 2 weeks. Now you see every blackpoll warbler within a month, and there's more birds coming early and there's more birds coming late. And it used to be for 2 million years when the system was working, you take this plinko board and you take all those little pegs out and you drop the thing from the top, and every bird goes straight down and hits the $100,000 prize because all the timing works perfectly for them. Okay, a few end up on the ones to the left and right, which shouldn't be zeros. That's the $5,000 prize. You're a week, you're 3 days late. You're probably still going to breed, but nobody's entering these ones on the far ends because everybody's got a good system and they're all migrating together. But now we say this is, we had a peg because the insect blooms messed up. We had a peg because there's more extreme weather. We had a peg because their foraging on their wintering grounds has been reduced because the patch of the forest has been reduced. And every one of those messes the bird up and it gets ding, 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 a little bit off from the center. And as you start to get to the outside, you're not going to end up breeding successfully. So the plinko effect is a real impact. Everybody used to be perfect, and now everybody's getting pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and more to the sides. Nighttime interruptions are also really bad for birds. It's not the clearest graph, but essentially what it's saying is if birds are disturbed at night, then the next day they spend more time in things like REM sleep. So if you mess up their sleep, it increases their stress. It impairs their cognitive functions because you're screwing up their REM sleep, so they're not learning. And it's even changing their reproductive physiology. So birds breed based on photoperiod. So what happens if the robin's sleeping in your yard in the winter and then you put up a bunch of Christmas lights and now all of a sudden it's light in the middle of the night? Ding, ding, ding. Robin tries to breed. So there's a lot of things like nighttime is nighttime, and it should be for the birds. It's really, really important. You don't want this hungover blue jay hanging out at your bird feeder. Migration, nighttime's even more important. It messes with their timing. They're supposed to depart when the sun goes down, but if everything's lit up, they don't know the sun's down. Predation, they're part of the reasons they're migrating at night is to reduce predation. What eats birds? Other birds. But those birds are mainly diurnal. But now it's not really dark at night, so maybe those birds are a little bit more active. They look at the sun angle to orient themselves before they depart, but now they're looking at New York City. They think that's the sun, so that's messing up their angle. False sunrise, they see a big city, they think that's the sun coming up, so they come down to land, but it's not the sun coming up. They're attracted to light, so they fly into buildings and airplanes. All these kinds of huge problems with nocturnal migration and daylight. So I close with the night is a world lit by itself. So dim your lights and let the night shine. Most of this stuff came from this book. This is a really, really cool book. It just came out last year. It's fully allowed as a download of the PDF from the MIT website. They're distributing it for free. I have a paper copy of it. A really, really cool book, up-to-date research on all this brain stuff. You got to kind of really brain oriented, but you can just think about how that impacts bird behavior. But I got most of my graphics came from that, so I want to give a shout out to these guys. And I'm going to stop right there. That's what I got. This was a really cool thing for me to learn about. I'm much more of a behavioralist and a kind of population guy. I'm not a physiologist, but this is really, really interesting stuff. And I kind of hope you guys thought it was too. I can go ahead and stop sharing my screen and go see if I can take any questions. Let's see if I can share my picture. There you go. Am I in everybody's screen? No.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we can see you.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I definitely tried to step back in the amount of information I gave on this one. So hopefully it was a little bit more manageable for folks.
No, thank you very much. This was really just fascinating to hear. And especially Elizabeth had mentioned that the focus of our upcoming Earth Week is going to be on dark sky. And so, thanks for tying that in because it's just
Yeah,
so directly relevant.
yeah, absolutely. Something that we're really kind of we're understanding a lot more about the impacts of that. And I certainly, Chatham's not so bad, but man, every place in the country has installed lights that shine on your house all night long because now
Mhm.
LEDs are cheap, so you can light your house up. Your house
Mhm.
doesn't need to be illuminated all night. You're asleep. I go to my parents' house in Denver, and when they're not there, I just unplug the outdoor lights. I can't handle it. Like trying to sleep, and some reason the light from the tree is shining through my window, and then it's making me want to breed early because it's in my photo period, and it's just not working for me.
Oh. So I just want to let's just open it up to questions here. I've seen some comments come in on the chat, but anybody have any?
I can start it off if nobody has any questions right now. I really do like how you were able to tie dark skies in. So if people want to learn more about that, definitely come to our Earth Week. But speaking of the night, I was wondering how the birds don't fall out of the trees while they're sleeping.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one we actually are just starting to learn how that works, which is surprising. They have along their tendons, they have really tight tendons on their legs, and then the bones actually have little divots in them that match up with these little balls on the tendons. And so when they pull them tight, the little balls in the legs go right into the tendons, go right into the little holes in the bones and lock them right in. Because these birds do, like humans, when we go into REM sleep, our body goes into paralysis. That's what sleep paralysis is, because it keeps us from hurting ourselves when we're sleeping. We've all had partners that kick, but if you're dreaming about what you did the day before, you don't want to be like climbing the tree and running and jumping in your sleep because you're going to injure yourself. Birds don't do that. They can't afford to go into this paralysis because half of their body's still awake and they need to be able to flee. So their legs lock in so they don't have to worry about their legs and this kind of falling out of tree stuff. But because they're REM sleep, we saw with those ostriches, it doesn't shut down their body movement like it does with us. So it's really important that they're locked in. So when they're dreaming and their head's moving around all this, they're not like falling out of the tree in the middle of the night. Um, and the legs are really important for heat transfer. Feathers are super insulating. So most of the heat loss and gain in birds comes through their legs. So that's why you see things like shorebirds with one leg tucked up because they're actually controlling their body temperature by doing that. And sleep's important, and it's a hard thing to understand. With us,
Yeah. Other questions? You can either put them in the chat box or just start speaking.
I have a question, James.
yeah, sure, go ahead, Warren.
Yeah, uh, I'm always amazed that birds can survive during these huge, awful snowstorms that we have with the very cold weather. Do they migrate on a short-term basis, or do they just hide in the bush? And how do they survive?
There's a few different things that can happen with that. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the Cape is a really good place to expand your range because how long has it been since we've had one of these snowy winters? Like 8 years. So most years you do just fine. And then you have one bad year, and a lot of birds end up dying. So the Carolina wrens, it's going to be hard to find a Carolina wren this spring because they need to be on the ground to forage. But a lot of birds are facultative migrants. So they'll migrate. The most famous one we have is yellow rump warbler, incredibly common bird on the Cape in the winter. No, incredibly common. A bird that's on the Cape in the winter in big numbers. On these cold years, they'll make another jump. So most of the yellow runs from the Cape are probably down in New Jersey right now. But on a lot of years, they won't do that. They'll just stay farther north, but they do react to the snow and go farther south. But a lot of birds, it has a huge impact. They'll hunker down and try to wait it out. But if they can't get access to food, it'll lead to mortalities in a lot of birds. But that's the risk you take with range expansion, right? Carolina wrens were not on the Cape at all. So if you're all these birds that we see moving north are birds that kind of need exposed soil to feed in the winter, and most years they're getting it, and some years they're not. And evolution can act on a single weather event, and we see that on the Cape where those birds are impacted in huge ways by a single storm. So yeah, some birds try to tough it out. Some birds will change what they're feeding on, and some birds just get hit, and it will impact their population, and they will have to rebound. So yeah, there's a lot of different responses to it. But birds have more ability to move in the winter. That's a really well-established concept. During the breeding season, you got to nest. You got to take care of your nest. During winter, you ain't got nothing, so you can move around a lot more. Some birds hold territories, but a lot of birds are just able to move. And they're really good at sensing the weather. They'll move ahead of time when they know it's coming. It's life or death. Thanks, Warren.
James, there are a couple of other snow-related questions here. Jeannie Branson says, we lost power in Chatham for 5 nights and noticed a distinct increase in bird behavior and noise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one to say, right? Because if you lose power, you're losing all your distractions. So there's nothing to do but hear the birds because it's nothing else playing in your house. You think that if your TV's off, your house is quiet, but the fridge makes sound, the heating makes sound. And it could be that the birds are being louder. It could also be that you have some good berry bushes in your yard that the birds didn't need until everything got covered in snow. And then whatever resource you have, they're way more dependent on when the whole ground's covered with snow. So that's more likely what it is. It could be that there's some more. Birds will follow other birds to food. It's complicated. That's part of the living in a colony thing, is if you're not finding food, but some other bird keeps coming back with food, you can follow that bird to food. And it could be that they're much more dependent on following other birds to more limited food resources during a storm. If the ground's exposed, you can kind of feed everywhere, but if the ground's not, you got to eat berries, and there's a limited number of berry producing plants. So that could be that they're like more conversational because they're more dependent on other birds' knowledges to find foods during a storm event. I could see that. Okay. Or it could just be that you got no power in your house, so the birds are more present in your life.
Okay, and then another question, why don't birds' feet freeze?
Yeah, they do. If you see up here in Canada, in Montreal, if you look at the mourning doves, you have a lot more mourning doves missing toes that they lost to frostbite up here than you do farther south. But birds run hot, and they have a thing in it's another really important biological concept. It's called countercurrent heat exchange. And the veins or the capillaries that go out to their feet lie right next to the ones coming off of their feet. So the hot blood going out to the feet crosses over the cold blood coming in from the feet, and then the warm blood warms up the cold blood before it goes into the body. So essentially, they're shunting out the cold before it goes back into their body. But yeah, the reason their feet do freeze. And there's a reason they keep them tucked up. And there's a reason you see the ducks sitting a lot in the winter, because their feet are tucked inside. So yeah, they do freeze, and you see it. And mourning doves, again, are one of these northern expansion birds that live in Montreal in the winter, but they didn't used to. They're here because of the bird feeders. And yeah, it's like you can age a mourning dove based on the fact that it's missing toes, because you've made it through one winter. So yeah, they do. And most of these birds do survive, but these extreme events impact them, and birds definitely have their feet freeze. Sometimes they get stuck to stuff.
I actually had a question about what do the turkeys, primarily on the Cape, since we have so many, what do they do when there's a storm like we just had?
Yeah, I don't, I mean, the answer is a very generic answer. So they do forage a lot on the ground. Um, a lot of them will feed off of, I see them eating black locust a lot, like awkwardly hopping up into the lower branches of the tree that's like a foot off the ground and eating those. So they probably switch over to that a lot of it. And my guess is the population will get knocked back. But well, they do, a lot of what they probably do is what a lot of the mammals do, which is they could probably dig fairly well. So they might be digging. But yeah, the turkey population will get knocked down with this storm. But they live farther north. There's turkeys in Quebec now, never were before, and they're surviving the harsh winter up here somehow. And it looks like there's snow cover everywhere, but I bet if you get into some of those real dense thickets of like the maples and stuff, they're able to find some foraging ground. But yeah, birds that feed on the ground take hard hits in the snow.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, James, thank you so much.
Yeah,
On behalf
absolutely.
of CCF and the audience here and our other members, it's always great to have you every year, and we look forward to James is one of the folks that we have lead always every summer, a trip usually to Strong Island. So look for that sometime in the summer. So we're just happy to have this affiliation with you, and thanks for being a good friend to the foundation.
Oh, I'm very, very happy. I'm lucky to be associated, and I'm glad to get to do these things. I didn't. A lot of this is not my area of study, but I find it really interesting to learn about new stuff. And a chance to present it means you really have to kind of learn it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is great. I love talking about biology. So, and it's such a good group and such a good organization. I'm glad to be involved with you guys.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. And just wishing everybody a good weekend. And as Elizabeth said, take a look. We have 3 more webinars in this series. So take a look at that. And we will have our Earth Week series of events posted probably in the next week or so. And I think it's going to be really exciting for those of you that are here on the Cape. We hope to see you at an event coming up in April. So thanks again. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.